I can't believe I've never made a video on this specific topic before, as it's probably the most commonly used word when discussing composition, especially landscape composition, and it's the word foreground. You'd be hard-pressed to read or listen to or watch something on landscape compositions without hearing the word foreground just bounced all over the place. But you rarely hear much in regards to how to effectively identify these powerful and often elusive foreground elements. When I first started to study and really dig into the art of composition, I recall being on location and working towards applying the things that I had learned to improve my own landscape photos, which often resulted in me wandering around for hours with my head down, becoming increasingly frustrated looking for foreground interest, which I very rarely ever found, mainly because I wasn't 100% certain as to what I should be on the lookout for. I knew I needed to put something in the foreground, but I wasn't sure exactly what it should be specifically. And in this video, I want to share with you 5 techniques that will help you to quickly and successfully identify foreground interest the next time you're on location. And something about all of this that I find really interesting is that if you were to look up online best compositional practices for portrait photographers, you probably wouldn't hear much about foreground. If you were to look up compositional tips for sports photography, you're probably not going to hear much about foregrounds. But if you look up compositional tips for landscape photography, every other word has to do with foreground. And I think a lot of it has to do with the commonly used focal lengths for each genre of photography. So portrait photographers very rarely, if ever, use a wide angle or a ultra wide angle lens. Sports photographers almost always use a telephoto or a super telephoto lens. And landscape photographers very often use a wide angle lens. And a wide angle focal length is the lens, or I should say, is the focal length where it's most important to ensure that things in your scene are different distances from your camera. Because if everything in your scene when you're using a wide angle lens is the same distance from your lens, you're going to be left with a photograph where everything in your composition appears to be the same or a very similar size, and everything appears that it's on the same exact plane, which ultimately results in an image that's very flat and otherwise dull to really look at. And I always found that very interesting, where that's why I think you hear with landscape photography, it's so important to have something in the foreground and ideally something in the midground and in the background, because those 3 zones are all going to appear different sizes and they're all going to appear that they're different distances from one another, which is ultimately going to result in that 3-dimensional looking photograph that we're all after. And I think that's one of the biggest issues when using a wide angle lens is it's very often it's very easy to come away with a very flat looking image if you don't make sure that things are different distances from your camera. So before we jump right into the 5 techniques, I got a really good example right here. This is an image from Yosemite Valley. I shared this on Instagram, I believe, last week. And a great photograph. I love it. You know, you have this incoming storm coming right through here on the right side. And I just think it's a photograph that I'm really happy with. But there's not a lot of foreground interest in this image. This tree right here is really the only real semblance of anything in the foreground. But when I look at this photograph, everything appears that it's the same distance away. Everything appears that it's kind of relatively the same size. And this was shot with a 16-35, I think. It wasn't wide open. I want to say it was around 20 millimeters maybe. I'll put it on the screen for the video as well. But now this image right here, same exact composition, just took quite a few steps backward and zoomed out farther to capture this tree on the left side. And this image right here just has a much more 3-dimensional feeling to the photograph. There's a lot more depth in this image. And it also kind of, I think, more accurately describes the grandiose nature of this scene. So if you compare this image here to this image here, I don't think either one of them is a bad photograph, but I just think they're totally different. So no foreground and with foreground. And I think that's just a really good example to see let me try that again, to be able to see what a foreground interest can do to a photograph when you're using a wide angle lens. Now to jump into the 5 techniques, and these aren't in any specific order at all, these are just things that really help me out when I'm struggling to find a foreground interest to put in front of my main subject, which is very, very common for me. And the very first one is to look for contrasting color or interesting color is a great thing to do, especially when you're really, really struggling looking for that tangible item to put in your foreground. If you just kind of shift your perspective a little bit and just look for contrasting colors, that might be able to help you out as well. And that's exactly what happened in this scenario right here. I really couldn't find any type of foreground outside of these rocks, and I just kind of found this area right through here where there's a lot of contrast. You had this area of rock, which was much more dry than this side, and the light was also hitting this side as well. So you got two contrasting colors. They're both the same types of stone and everything, but just the contrasting colors just makes that foreground interest much more appealing and much more interesting to kind of anchor the photograph. Because without this foreground right through here, everything would appear that it was on the same plane in this image, and everything would appear basically the same kind of size, and it would just look very flat. Here's another example right here where you have this yellow fall tree here, and you got a little bit of orange right through here. Two contrasting colors that contrast very well against this green and kind of dark color, black, brown background right through here to kind of anchor this waterfall through here. So contrasting colors is a fantastic thing to look for. And here's a really good example from my recent trip to Acadia. You have this wave crashing against the black rock right through here. You can just see a lot of aqua coming through the water. And then you also have this kind of brown color rock right here as well. So there's three contrasting colors all right through here in the foreground. And it just adds a lot of depth to this photograph, and it makes the lighthouse seem like it's on a completely different plane than the foreground, and adds that kind of three-dimensional feeling to the overall photograph, which I really, really like. I'm really happy the way this image turned out. Now, the next technique, and it's something that I forget about often, but when I was kind of preparing for this video, I was like, oh, that is pretty helpful for me, but it's to look for interesting textures. Whenever you're struggling, if you kind of shift your mindset again, looking for textures, it's 9 times out of 10, you're going to be able to find some kind of interesting texture on the ground somewhere in nature. And nature's filled with it. And here's an example from Acadia National Park, where the tide had retreated and left all of this really interesting seaweed. But if you were to remove all the seaweed and it was just rock, it wouldn't be as interesting as all of this texture right through here. So all of this texture really, I think it works as great foreground interest to kind of lock down this kind of foreground area here, and then you have your midground area right through here, and then you have your background, and this kind of adds a little bit more depth to this overall photograph. In this image here, very, very interesting texture, I guess you could say. I certainly wouldn't want to rub my hand across this cactus, but the cactus does provide that texture to look at, to kind of grab the viewer's attention and kind of begin that optical journey throughout this photograph. And this is just another great example of utilizing foreground just to kind of create that separation between the foreground and the midground and the background, which really creates a lot of depth in this photograph. Because if I were to kind of cut this image off right here at the bottom, this image would look very flat and everything would kind of look like it was the same distance from the camera. But this cactus in the foreground creates that illusion that or I shouldn't say the illusion, it's really what it looked like in real life, but it kind of adds that three-dimensional quality back into this image. And then this right here as well, I'm not 100% certain as to what this is growing on this rock. Maybe it's not growing, maybe it's just on the rock. If you happen to know, let me know in the comment section. But I thought it was really cool. There was a lot of cool texture, and it really reminded me of kind of like gold flakes that were just kind of peppered all along this kind of rocky seashore right through here. And then you had the wave crashing up against it. But all of this contrasting color and interesting texture in this one, I mean, because if you think about it, if all of this kind of gold flake was gone and all of this foreground just looked like these sea stacks in the background, this foreground would look very dull and very boring. But because there is interesting texture with it and there is contrasting colors, it just makes that foreground interest really kind of pop off the screen and kind of lock this image down. And then you have your foreground, you got the wave in the background, the wave in the midground, and then the sea stacks in the background, and this creates that three-dimensional feeling. Now, the next technique is repeating shapes. Nature is filled with shapes, and it's something that I forgot. I think maybe I read an article or maybe I listened to a podcast, but they were talking about shapes in nature, and I never really paid attention to shapes per se. But when I started to shift my mindset to really look for shapes in nature, it really helped me in identifying, one, compelling compositions, but also foreground interest. And here's a good example, a very obvious example of repeating shapes. Bunch of triangles pointing into the center part of the scene. One even over here, just kind of drawing the viewer's eye into the photograph. Sometimes it's not always so obvious where you have kind of like partial triangles. This isn't the best image in the world, but there are I think it is a good example of shapes. Triangle, triangle, triangle right through here. Even this whole thing right here is kind of a triangle, although it's not quite as obvious as the last example, but you can kind of see that there are triangular shapes in this foreground that naturally kind of point toward the viewer's eye into the image. Here's another example right here where not all of these shapes are exactly the same. None of these are really all circular shapes, but they're all shapes that are repeating that kind of draw the viewer's eye into the overall photograph. Here's one more image right here where tons of repeating shapes that draw the viewer's eye in. And you can see that I got very close to the boulders here in the foreground that made these boulders seem much larger than they would have if I would have been standing, 50 yards back. And it creates that illusion of that three-dimensional feeling that I saw when I was on location, because the size of the rocks in the foreground are substantially bigger than the rocks in the midground and in the background, and that adds that three-dimensional feeling, and that kind of gets away from that overly flat-looking image that you can accidentally create when you're using a wide-angle lens. Now, the next technique is repeating patterns, and this one is probably one of the ones that I use most often, and it's not super common to run across, I suppose. I don't know. I'm always looking for repeating patterns in a lot of my images, and I found this one right here. I've never shared this photograph before. One of my images that I was most proud of when I first got into landscape photography. I think this might have been my first year, maybe my second year, but I really love this image from New York. This is the Brooklyn Bridge Pier, and all of these repeating patterns that just kind of draw the viewer's eye into the scene. This is a classic shot from this location, but I just loved all of these patterns right through here, which is a very interesting foreground. Here's another image right here where you have the sea or the ocean retreating back, and it's just kind of moving from the bottom left-hand corner of the frame towards the right side of the frame. And it just kind of creates this pattern for the eye to follow, and it creates a little bit more depth in the overall photograph. In this image right here, you can tell that, once again, shot with a wide-angle lens, but these sea stacks all look like they're on the exact same plane, even though the one in the center was a little bit farther in front than the ones in the background. So this image kind of has a little bit of that flat feeling to it, but I think that the ocean in the foreground kind of creates that repeating pattern that does add a little bit more depth. That kind of helps this image out a little bit. And here is one more example right here with these staircases, another example of repeating patterns that just draw the viewer's eye up into the scene. So shifting your mindset to look for these types of repeating patterns. Like I said, when I was preparing for this video, I didn't really look at this when I was composing this image as repeating patterns. It was just something that kind of drew my eye into the photograph, but it absolutely is. These rectangular stairs are just repeating one after another to just naturally draw the viewer's eye into the photograph. And you can tell how the stair at the very bottom seems substantially larger than the stair up here, but these are all the same size steps, but this one seems much larger than this one up here. And that creates that three-dimensional feeling. And once again, this is shot with a wide-angle lens. Now, the fifth and the final technique is hands down the most common, probably the most popular. We all know about it, but it's the use of leading lines. And here's a good example. And I think when you can create leading lines that lead towards the brightest area of your scene, that is just an absolute win. It doesn't always happen, but when it does, I think it really works well because the eye is naturally going to gravitate towards the brightest part of your scene. And if your leading lines can draw the viewer's eye to that area, just a win-win. But I really like this one right here. I love this soft glow, and I love how these almost perfectly shaped lines are just kind of retreating back. Another image right here, and I think leading lines, they don't always have to be straight. They can be kind of curved around. You can see these are an S curve right through here, and the S kind of stops here, but then you have more lines that kind of draw up in this direction. So I don't think the lines always need to be straight. They don't always need to lead to the brightest part of your scene. It's nice that they do, but any kind of line for the viewer's eye to follow that begins in the foreground, I think is just a fantastic best practice. And then one more example right here, just the waves retreating, which is something I absolutely love to do on when I'm shooting any kind of seascapes, is to get in the water, and then as the water is the ocean is retreating back, you get just great leading lines that draw the viewer's eye into the photograph, which is exactly what was done right through here. I kind of wish these were leading a little bit more towards this area right through here. I feel like this image is kind of leading the viewer's eye out of the image, but nevertheless, it does create some interesting foreground that gives that kind of three-dimensional quality to this image. So those are the 5 techniques that I try and focus on whenever I'm struggling to identify foreground interest in my own landscape photos, which is very, very often. I find that identifying foreground interest is one of the more difficult things as far as composition is concerned. I can't tell you how many times I find an amazing subject, waterfall, a canyon, an awesome tree, whatever the case may be, but then you spend hours trying to find some kind of foreground interest to put in front of it. So utilizing these 5 techniques has definitely helped me out, and I really hope it helps you out as well. Now, if you have any questions about any of these 5 techniques or anything at all, please leave those in the comments section below, and I guarantee I will get back in touch with you. And if you did enjoy this week's video, if you could give it that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. And as always, I really do appreciate you watching this week's video, and I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.